Hello. So today we go on to looking at the work of Michel Foucault, who without doubt is one of the most prominent intellectuals of the 20th century. His work spans psychiatry, history, sociology, philosophy, and much more. But more importantly, he gave us a way to think about power and knowledge and identity in ways that hadn't been done before, and that really reshaped trajectories in social theory, literary theories, and so on. So let's take a look at Michel Foucault. The next few lectures, in fact 2 or 3 lectures, would be on the work of Michel Foucault. Today I will build an overall kind of a framework of situating his work, and then in the next lecture go on to looking at one of his books primarily, titled Discipline and Punish. So Michel Foucault was born in 1926 into a rich bourgeois family which had a lineage of surgeons. In fact, his father was a very successful surgeon and wanted Foucault to go in his footsteps. Foucault's grandfather was also a surgeon. So it was like a family of surgeons, and he was born around the time when you can see 1926. What I've done today is also put part of it into brackets, like his formative years. He saw the Second World War, he saw Nazi occupation of France, and that gave him a sort of positionality of critique vis-a-vis the state and authoritarian power. Then he goes on, after his schooling, he went to a Catholic school, and did very well. And then he goes on to École Normale Supérieure, one of the most prestigious places in France, in Paris. And this period of his college life is a period where he witnesses the beginnings of the Cold War. There is also rising debates on existentialism with Sartre, and structuralism with Levi-Strauss and others. So a very dynamic time intellectually. In fact, Foucault as a student was very close to Louis Althusser, a Marxist scholar also in the cultural domain, and he was also influenced by Marxist thought. So all of these ideas and events of the world are shaping the young Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault is widely known to be a homosexual. In fact, his obituary stated that. There were multiple attempts at suicide. So a very troubled early years, up until much later of his life, where he struggled with his identity, his homosexuality, in trying to fit in but also be his own self. And he has himself said that a lot of his work is in fact his own biography. So, what can be a better example for us to look at what Mills had called the sociological imagination? I mean, Foucault is applying it in the most brilliant way possible. Well, moving on, after graduating, he takes on teaching positions in Sweden, Poland, Germany. Around 1960, he also meets Daniel Differt, who goes on to become his lifelong partner. And when Foucault passes away from AIDS in 1984, Differt, in fact, was the one who Foucault gave his property to, his papers to, his intellectual writings to, with the explicit instruction not to publish them posthumously. So that was unique in the case of Foucault. We know from Marx, for example, a lot of his writings came out posthumously through the efforts of his collaborator Friedrich Engels. But in the context of Foucault, did not give the permission to do that. His work, as he was doing his doctoral work, was in the domain of psychiatry and psychology, also medicine. His father wanted him to be a surgeon, but Foucault was much more interested in philosophy and history. And so he wrote a history of madness. And so that was his early work. The Birth of the Clinic and The Order of Things. These are his early work where he is trying to understand how these categories came to be, how somebody gets labeled as mad and how somebody gets labeled as sane. And you will see that his large project is about what constitutes as truth when. So it's not about what is truth, it is about what is the truth at what point in history. Then, after order of things, this was a controversial period for him in France, and for a brief time he moves to Tunisia, but then returns just after the May 1968 student revolts, and also witnesses part of it and its effects, and is elected to Collège de France as a professor of systems of thought and knowledge, something to that effect. And his major task was to develop ideas, to lecture his ideas, and to research and write. And a very productive period. Many of his, what I've listed up here are mainly his books, but he also gave some very significant lectures while he was in Collège de France, which eventually became parts of his books also, and have been compiled as edited volumes. So 1969, the archaeology of knowledge. Now the period prior to this is when he is mainly trying to understand what constitutes as knowledge. Like I said, what constitutes as truth and when. So he's going behind how discourse gets made and what counts as right knowledge, what kind of questions are possible to ask at what point. So the conditions of possibility of knowledge is what he is trying to understand in this phase of his work. And then 1971 onwards, he writes Nietzsche, Genealogy and History, Discipline and Punish, and History of Sexuality. By this time, his work also is very interested in how institutions shape us, so how do asylums, how do hospitals, how do schools, how do the various institutions shape individual subjects. So that is his core project in these three books. And then eventually, towards the end of his life, and very much reflected in the history, the last two volumes of History of Sexuality, is the ethics of self, the technologies of self, how we constitute ourselves as subject. He himself did not kind of give these phases to his work, but future, after his death, several scholars have read his work, interpreted his work, and have written volumes over it. And so Paul Rabinow, for example, being one, and so they kind of break down Foucault's thinking into three parts. He would say that they are all basically answering the same question, which is this, but they are also approaching it from different directions. But in terms of looking at how each one is doing it, one is archaeology, then genealogy, and then ethics is largely the accepted understanding of Michel Foucault's oeuvre of work. So Foucault's central project, and in his own words, this is from a retrospective essay that he wrote titled Subject and Power, and here he says, my objective has been to create a history of the different modes by which in our culture human beings are made subjects. So many scholars think of Michel Foucault as somebody who is a scholar of power, who's trying to understand how power works, and it's easy to kind of fall into that misunderstanding. But he himself clarified it and saying that he looks at power, but not because that's his central project. He looks at how power works in order to understand what makes us as subjects, right? So let us take a look at what he means by subject and the various ways that he thinks, that he argues how we are made as subjects. So he says there are two meanings of the word subject. One is subject to someone else by control and dependence, and one is tied to his own identity by their conscience or self-knowledge. So one, you become a subject, and in the other one you are also subjectified, you are subjected to something, to power, external. So one is external and one is internal. And there are three modes, he says, of objectification that transform humans into subjects. The subject is the knowing I, right? Just to clarify, it's the knowing I who is self-reflexive, self-conscious, and thinking, writing, speaking subject. He says that in the modern period especially, there are three modes through which subjects are made. Two of them are the external subjectification, and one of them is the internal subjectification. Fields of knowledge, he says, or modes of inquiry constitute us as objects of study. So biology, in its outlining of where humans are situated in the list of species, for example, or what are the organs that form the human body. Linguistics in its analysis of language and how we speak, and economics in the laboring body, in the laboring subject, in an understanding of that. Medical science, much more, psychology, psychiatry, all of these bodies of knowledge are actually creating productive of the subject, right? The other way in which this happens is also through a scientific understanding of what he calls dividing practices. And there can be two kinds of divisions. There is the division within oneself and division from others. Division oneself could be when someone internalizes norms, and then these norms divide one's, create a schism between one's desire and one's ascribed identity, or between impulse and notions of morality that one has imbibed, between consciousness and body. So these are divisive, fragmentary forces within oneself. The other way that this happens is when science categorizes. One of the prime things that science has been doing in the modern era, starting from the classical era, is classification, is categorization, is right versus wrong, moral versus immoral, hierarchizing. So there is, the notions of sane versus insane, citizen, alien, healthy, sick. So all of these ways of dividing also makes one into subjects, like how one gets to know oneself. The third process, he says, is an internal process, which is through forms of self-conscious reflection, through things like confession, through internalizing norms, self-discipline, and self-formation. He goes into details on this in many texts, but what we will be talking about in our next lecture, Discipline and Punish, you'll get a better sense what we mean when we are talking about internalizing, and what we mean when we're talking about self-discipline, and how that constitutes us as a subject in this particular episteme. Then he says that both these meanings of the subject, right, when you are constituted by someone else through control or dependence, and when it's tied to self-knowledge or self-conscience, both these meanings suggest a form of power that subjugates and makes subject to. So now we want to look at what he means by power and how he understands power. If you remember in our class from Weber, we also looked at power. We looked at power as the ability for someone to make another person do something despite resistance, right? So that was how Weber conceptualized power, and he situated it quite firmly in the state, right? So Foucault has a very different understanding of power. For Foucault, power is not something that somebody possesses. It is not something that a figure of authority possesses. It is not like a monarch or a president has the power, right? It is something that is relational, that exists in all relations. It is, in fact, he uses the term capillary. It is everywhere, and it is in all social relations. And this power is not repressive. It is productive. And I just spoke about how it produces. So this power produces subjects. It produces us in how we are. And therefore, he sees it as a productive thing. A power is a productive process. And it works through the conduct of conduct, right? So it conducts us, it instructs us, or not very explicitly, and pardon me for being using some loose words, but this is the first lecture on Foucault, and we will go on to looking at it more in a more detailed manner, and you will get a better understanding when we go into discipline and punish. He also writes that wherever there is power, there is resistance. So they are, in fact, they are always coexisting, and in that relationality they make us into subjects. And in fact, we come to know of power through when we start to resist it, when there is a struggle. That's when we come to know that there is power in this relation. Let us read two quotes that I have put up here, one from Power Knowledge, his selected interviews, and one from the History of Sexuality, that I think will give you a better sense of what he means by power. He writes, "What makes power hold good, what makes it accepted, is simply the fact that it does not weigh on us as a force that says no, but that it traverses and produces things. It induces pleasure, forms of knowledge, produces discourse." Very important. Discourse, by discourse he means those statements, those understandings, those norms that form like a collective understanding, which is particular to that time period. And to take it collectively, all the books, the statements, the newspapers, the media, what we are being told inside families, all of them are part of a discourse. And he also here is talking about something, is that power and knowledge have to be seen as together. Each one of them constitute the other. So for that he writes, "Power and knowledge directly imply one another. There is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge." We understand that, right? Implicitly we understand that. For example, in our universities, the professor, the one who professes knowledge, also holds a lot of power. Disciplines, it's not a coincidence that discipline, which we also take as self-discipline, or in that sense, right, conduct of is also the same term for fields of study, disciplines. So there is very clearly a power, knowledge, you can say that they need to be seen together. They directly imply one another, he writes. There is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. No wonder, knowledge is such a contentious thing. What gets written in history books, what gets left out, who are the heroes of their time, what chapters to include in a textbook. These are things that are forms of knowledge, but also plays of power. That is a somewhat simplistic understanding, but it's important to remember that for Foucault, power is relational, it is productive, it is not repressive, it is not only repressive, and with power comes resistance. They also go hand in hand. All right, let's come to the ways in which he's trying to come to this understanding, to understand how we come to be made as subjects. And one of the processes, or you could say, although he might disagree with the use of the word method, but one of the ways in which he does it is by employing what he calls archaeology. And when we say archaeology, what comes to our mind? Digging comes to our mind, for example. So here he is not excavating or digging archaeological sites, but he is digging deep into discourse to understand the mechanisms of that particular discourse. Also, this is not something that is looking for deep truths, or that this is true or that is true. It is looking at what makes particular truths possible at particular times. What constitutes as an understanding of knowledge? What disciplines are possible at particular points? We spoke about in the beginning of this course how sociology could only be constituted as a discipline once the idea of social as being divinely ordained was challenged. So there was a moment in history where a particular form of knowledge becomes possible. That is the kind of archaeology he is looking at. So let's read out a few quotes from his texts, primarily archaeology of knowledge, but also the order of discourse and the order of things. He writes, I would like to show that discourse is not a slender surface of contact or confrontation between a reality and a language. It is not that you're using language to understand or explain or describe reality. We shall have to admit that discourse is not a mere place of encounter between language and a reality. It is the space in which language and reality are constituted. So as we speak, we also constitute, we also produce. It is not just that we describe or explain, but the very act of speech, the very act of understanding, of knowledge, is also producing that reality that we are trying to explain. Then he writes, in every society, the production of discourse is at once controlled, selected, organized and redistributed according to a certain number of procedures. This is what the example I was trying to give you about the contentions, let's say, around history textbooks all around the world, or literature textbooks. What's appropriate, what is acceptable, what can be spoken, what can be taught, what constitutes knowledge, what is just not really knowledge, not worth putting into textbooks. These are the kind of questions that reveal to us in some limited way maybe what he is trying to tell us. Then in order of things he writes, it is not words that speak, it is not men who speak. We are spoken by the discourses that define the epistemological field in which knowledge is formed. So in fact, I am not really going into that text, but he has a very fascinating essay called What is an Author? And in that he debunks the idea of author as a creative, innovative, intellectual, independent force. He in fact situates the author within a discourse, and an author as a subject themselves who is making whatever knowledge is possible or whatever ways of thinking are possible at that time because of language, because of culture, because of certain power relations, is able to put words to whatever he or she is putting words to. In the same text, Archaeology of Things, he then goes on to say that at particular time periods in history, certain things become possible to say or write or form as knowledge. And then he breaks these periods into episteme. He says by episteme, we mean the total set of relations that unite at a given period the discursive practices which give rise to the sciences. In any given culture and at any given moment, there is always only one episteme that defines the conditions of possibility of all knowledge. And he traces that. He traces that through the Renaissance period, through the classical period, and then through the modern period. And he says that in the Renaissance, the episteme was that of resemblance or trying to find semblance. So one example for that is often given is that when you notice the leaf, the shape of a leaf resembles a particular organ in the body, then in that particular discourse at that particular time, it could be argued that this leaf or this plant can cure the disease associated with that organ. So that was the form through which knowledge was being constituted. In the classical period, he writes, there was knowledge was being constituted through classification, categorization, and through that it became possible to know subjects and things. And then in the modern period, he said it is only in the modern period that the category of man emerges as something, as a field of knowledge, as somebody that can be studied and that's somebody who can study. In fact, he goes on later to as much argue as since man as a, as a subject, as a category, only came up in the 1800s, it is also not going to last forever. And one could, probably see that maybe in how notions of post-humanism or going past the Anthropocene with climate change, now with AI, what different categories emerge at different points in history is something that he's alerting us to. We are still very much centered in the man, and we are still very much centered in the disciplines such as sociology and economics and physics and so on. But just wanted to alert you to that one sentence that he has in this text. Then he writes, "The episteme is that which makes the appearance of sciences possible and therefore determines their shape. But it does so by constituting the conditions of their emergence, not by prescribing their form." So certain conditions emerge, and it is not the doing of any one person or a group of people. The conditions emerge because of several relations, and then those conditions make possible particular ways of knowing and particular kinds of questions that can be asked at that particular time. This is my last slide. Towards the end of his work, well, not so much the end of his work, the end of his work I said was more a phase of ethics and technologies of the self, but a large part of that also, and after archaeology of knowledge, and with his essay on Nietzsche drawing heavily from him, he shifts from archaeology to genealogy. Again, although he will say that he is doing both. So archaeology gave him an understanding of discourse, but he also needed an understanding of power. And so genealogy helps him situate power, and also helps him understand subject formation by understanding institutions and norms such as schools, asylums, mental hospitals, other hospitals, prisons, and so on. So this shift is quite marked in his work in 1970s, where he moves from archaeology to genealogy. And for genealogy, he writes, "Genealogy is grey, which means that it's kind of not looking at a pristine past as something, it is not seeking origins. It can arise out of muddy, it can arise out of dark histories, out of accidents of history, and so it is grey, but it requires meticulous and patient documentation." So you go through documents, you go through logs, you go through records, and through an understanding of those, not necessarily the one that appears at the surface, but through piecing them together, you can come to a genealogy of power. And I will show you through his work in Discipline and Punish what he means when he says that in our next lecture. So he writes, "It operates on a field of entangled and confused parchments, on documents that have not been sorted and classified. Genealogy must show not only how and why the moral domain was established, but also how. The how is very important in Foucault. Over the course of centuries, it became a threat to itself, how it became a question, and how the question was posed in every age." So what is moral in every age, what is truth in every age, what is knowledge in every age is something that he is interested in, and how the institutions of that time, of that episteme, shape these understandings and these ideas. Then he says, if one takes seriously the Nietzschean critique of origins, genealogy must be opposed not only to the classical moment of history, that of origin. The search for origins must not be used to restore an unbroken continuity that operates beyond the dispersion of oblivion. Genealogy must show that what we take as natural, self-evident, or universal emerges from a complex series of accidents, reversals, or struggles. So genealogy is not just a linear history. In fact, he rejects linear teleological accounts of history. History for him happens through accidents, through coincidences, through contingencies. That's the kind of history Foucault is interested in, through a messy documentation but rigorous and detailed, patient documentation. You will see in Discipline and Punish how he goes about accomplishing such a project by looking at prison records, by looking at timetables, by looking at medical records, by looking at architectural plans and prison routines and so on. So with that, I will end today's class here and we meet in the next lecture. Thank you.